elections are supposed to just aggregate the preferences of the voters, right? So people might have different ideas what the right tax rate is, or also on social policy, how liberal the country should be, for example, on gay rights, and then elections are just a way, or perceived to be just a way, to aggregate all these different opinions of the people. So it's fair to say that most models in political economics are concerned with that. But it's not the only way to model elections, and not the only function of elections. So there's another literature that is about information aggregation. So here the idea is, well, elections are a way to somehow, or not to somehow, to get the information out of the people. What is the right decision? Right? Think about a bridge that should be built or not be built. Right? People know themselves best how often they will use this bridge. So if you just have a vote, should this bridge be built or not, that might be a way, maybe an imperfect way, but one way to get some inference about what these voters who are allowed to decide about this actually think. And this is also used in the political economics literature. And of course, the simplest way then is to just say, okay, we just focus on information. And then we just say, contrary to this aggregation, preference aggregation literature, we just assume voters all want the same, or would want the same if they had just full information. And this approach actually goes back a long time. Condorcet, Marquis de Condorcet, he lived at the time of the French Revolution and shortly before, and he already had this idea, not for election, but for trials and juries, right? Why do we let not one judge decide in some countries, in some systems, but a number of jurors, if this guy is innocent or not? Well, because they have different information, potentially different ideas how to access the case. And then just letting them vote about it might give you a better result. At least you hope for that. Okay. This one? Yeah. Okay, so this information aggregation literature was a bit out of focus, like came only back in the 1990s. There were other papers, but one important paper, Feders and Pesendorfer, they called their paper The Swing Voters Curse. It was exactly about this issue. So they made this very important point that if voters are rational when they vote, in such a setting where you aggregate information, then what really matters is only to make the right decision when 50% of the voters vote for building the bridge, 50% of the voters vote against building the bridge, right? At least if you have a simple majority system. Because then your vote decides if the bridge is being built or not. All right? So if you are totally rational, you will have to keep this in mind when making your decision. It actually doesn't matter if 100% of the other people vote against the bridge, it just doesn't matter how you decide. So you keep this in mind already. What does it say about the private information of the other people that I'm in a situation where 50% vote for and 50% vote against? Because only in this case, my vote makes a difference. And you might be more familiar to the winner's curse in auction theory, right? Winner's curse, what is this? Well, if information other people have is correlated to my own valuation, the thing I'm bidding to, then it's a famous result that if people don't consider this when bidding for the item at hand, they will pay too much. Right? You bid a lot, that means other people bid less than you, that means other people think this thing is not as valuable as you think. And if there's a connection between your valuation, your true valuation, and the valuation of the other people, then you have to consider this, otherwise you will bid too much. Very similar logic here. You try to use this information of the other players when making your decision. It's a little bit different, but the same idea. Only under some conditions will you win the auction, only when the other people bid relatively low, and here only under one condition you decide the elections. 50% vote left, 50% vote right, 50% vote build the bridge, 50% vote don't build the bridge, then you decide. And only then your vote counts, and you have to take it into account. Yes?
That means that if I'm not pivotal, then it's irrelevant what I do, and therefore, because the likelihood that I'm pivotal is low, I shouldn't vote, right? If it is costly for me.
If it was costly, that might be a problem. I assume there's no cost of voting.
Okay.
Of course, you can make it more complicated and then add the cost of voting. Of course, it might also be pleasurable to vote, right? I mean, that might be one of the reasons we actually observe people going to elections, because they actually see it as a form of consumption. So my personal view on why people vote is at least partly because they enjoy it, at least the ones who go, more than enough to compensate them for the cost of going there. Of course, it might also be social duty reasons, right? But you can also see it as a consumption good. Okay. Yeah. So, of course, in reality, it's clear models only considering information aggregation and models only considering preference aggregation, they miss something, right? Real elections, for example, for presidents in the US, they are clearly about both, right? And it's not only do I prefer more democratic politics, do I prefer more Republican politics, but it's also about, well, how good will this president actually be, for example, in fighting terrorism, right? That's not obvious when you decide between Bush and McCain and Obama, for example, who would be better in fighting terrorists. It's not so much about the ideology in this case, it's really, okay, who has the relevant experience, who will stay calm, stuff like this. So, actually, already Feders and Klingelhöfer themselves, they already elect this assumption of interest convergence among voters in a model of information aggregation. So they were already the first guys not only to come back with this information aggregation approach to elections, but also in a follow-up paper to their swing voters curse paper, they came up with this idea to combine both things. But what is still missing in their approach, in their paper, is that policy choices, they assume policy choices to be exogenously given. So coming back to this bridge example, all the features of the bridge are already given, right? You can't change the plan of the bridge. You can't build a smaller bridge or something instead. That's still missing in their model, and this is really what my model adds and what also changes the results very much, leading from a swing voter's curse to, in my case, a swing voter's blessing. That actually politicians decide about their platforms before the elections, and they are endogenously given and will be influenced from the perceived behavior of the voters. Right? And that turns out to make a huge difference. So what I have in my paper that's really new to the approach, I have electoral competition of ideological candidates who offer policy alternatives. So candidates themselves are also interested in policy. They are just not in there for the money or for just the feeling of power, but they care about policy. That's important. And yeah, they can actively choose positions before the elections take place. Right? What makes policies on offer endogenous in my paper, difference to before.
So do they have a two-dimensional utility function, which depends both on my chances to get elected and on the standpoint I have? Or?
Yes, exactly. That we will see in 2 slides, exactly what you said. Two-dimensional utility function. Okay, yeah, well, you guessed the slide very well. So there's a polity, a country, with 2 candidates, right? You can imagine them running for president or something like this. And 2 policy dimensions. The ideological policy dimension, and economists and political scientists who work formally make it simple, right? Policy is just a number between 0 and 1 on a line. 1 dimension to make it simple. And you can imagine 0 would be very high taxes, right? I mean, 0 to be further left, then we might talk about high taxes. 1, very low taxes, very right-wing policies. But it can be anything, right? It could also be social policy issues. And for simplicity, I assume there's only 1 dimension. Of course, sometimes you generalize it to many policy dimensions, but I want to focus, as I said before, on this quality dimension. So candidates have a quality queue that can be different between the candidates, and this is where we will have uncertainty over. So think about something I mentioned before, like fighting terrorism. It should be something people agree on. Right? So 99% of voters agree that it's better to have a president who is good in preventing terrorist attacks. Right? So I don't want divergent opinions on this dimension. Yeah, so we have a utility function. The candidates themselves, they care only about policy. Right? So I just do it with my hand, I don't like to do this. So P will be policy that's implemented. This Bj will be the preferred, or is the preferred policy point of candidate J. And, well, due to the squares and the minus, the further away policy that's implemented in this country is from what this candidate wants, the worse off he is. Quite standard, right? You want to be as close as possible to your policy bliss point, and well, the square is not really important, just want to make it increasing in distance. That's the only thing that really matters, and the squares just will lead to much simpler formulas than a more general formulation. So, two candidates, left and right, without really saying what that means. Think about what you want, tax rates, left for high taxes, right for low taxes. Could also be social policy. Whatever you want to think about. And P is just, as I said, I think before, the policy that will really be implemented in our country. Yeah, please.
So that means I choose a policy as a candidate, and I have to implement that one.
That will be what we have.
It's not necessarily the one which I really prefer. Because
exactly.
of strategic reasons, I take another policy.
Exactly. And we believe that candidates can commit, and there's also some empirical evidence that lots of platforms is implemented, in fact, in real.
So this utility function is my utility conditional that I get elected?
No, you will have this utility if you're elected or not. You care only about policy by assumption. I could add a term making the candidate also enjoy power, enjoy winning, but in this model it wouldn't make a difference, so I leave it away. But add a term liking to win elections, it doesn't make a difference.
So it doesn't matter for me whether I implement this policy P or somebody else.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Even if I don't win, I just care about the policy which is implemented.
Exactly.
I see.
So actually, if the other guy would win with your favorite policy, you would be perfectly happy.
Okay.
So this doesn't depend on the quality yet at all. So quality
no, I assume the candidates don't care about that. Also to make, yeah.
So it doesn't influence their utility.
No, it doesn't, by assumption.
Okay.
You can maybe justify this. I mean, I said I don't need a term that gives me how much I enjoy being in power, but if you added a very large term there for both candidates, you would actually get rid of concerns that they might also care about quality. So they would have this one advantage that if you assume they also enjoy power and you assume this enjoyment of power is large enough to always be larger than the quality difference, then you would also, yeah, maybe for people who doubt that.
This P is implemented policy once I am elected, right?
Yeah, so there will be one policy elected. We play this whole game one time, right, this election game, and this will be the policy implemented by the winning candidate and will actually be the platform the candidate who wins the elections announced before the elections. So there is perfect commitment.
If he changes his mind from BG to some other P, makes no sense, right? So it has BJ.
No, he can't change it. He's ruled out to...
He cannot change.
He can't change the platform. It's a quite standard assumption in...
So we don't need this utility function, right? Just my P will be BJ if I am elected.
No. He will... let's look at this later. But he will announce a policy platform that will not necessarily be his favorite platform, because he also wants to make sure the other candidate doesn't win with a platform that's even worse for him. So this won't be the same necessarily, only under some conditions.
I didn't quite get it, sorry. Why does it not announce BJ?
Because that might lead to losing the elections, right?
And he does want to win.
He wants a policy that's as close as possible to his favorite policy, and if it would lead to him losing against a policy that makes him worse off, he would rather want to compromise a bit on policy, right? You rather want to have let's assume you are very left-wing, you might prefer, and in your model, this model you prefer, to win with a social democratic policy than to lose against some extremely right-wing guy.
That's the idea of the second prize.
Yeah, that's not really a second part. Yeah, but you maximize your utility under the constraints you're facing.
So, I mean, in fact, it's hyper-rational, so to say, among the game played among the candidates. They anticipate what the equilibrium will be, given certain policy platforms which they choose, and they play, and the P will be what they get their utility from, which is the outcome of this, which is the equilibrium.
Policy.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Exactly like this. So, okay, as I say, BJ, just the preferred candidate, preferred policy bliss point, you can also say of candidate J, we have two candidates, L and R, could be left and right, doesn't really matter. And by assumption, but without any loss of generality, we just say the left candidate has a preferred policy further to the left than the right candidate. But this is just assigning names, right? We don't really know what that could mean, all kinds of things. Without loss of generality, we just name them left and right candidate. Okay, what about the voters? So there's an odd number of voters. Why an odd number? Well, it makes stuff much simpler. You get either the left guy or the right guy winning, at least as long as everybody participates in the elections. That makes stuff a bit simpler. It's not very restrictive. Voters also care about the quality of the candidates, not just about implemented policy. And because it makes stuff simpler, we just define this variable V, it's just the difference in quality between the candidates. It turns out everything depends only on the difference, so why talk about the absolute values then, if we can make notation simpler. Here, V is defined as the quality of the right candidate minus the quality of the left candidate. Of course, the left candidate can have the higher quality, then we just get a negative V, right? Doesn't make anything less general. Yeah, please.
If I understand correctly, so therefore those who become candidates are different from the rest of the population, because in which that they don't care about the quality of the winner because they are electing the
Yes,
candidate.
I mean, as I said, you could easily change this by just making them care enough about office so that the quality stuff just stays in the background.
Unimportant.
Yeah. So, okay, so we just quality advantage of the right candidate. And then the utility function of the voters. You see the first part. Oops. This looks just almost the same as in the case of the candidates, right? BI is now the policy bliss point of voter I. And P is implement policy again. And again, a voter will suffer more the further away the implemented policy is from his favorite point, BI. And then the additional point, Q, right? How much quality I have. It's basically additive to make it simple, right? I am happier if there are better candidates elected. And you see there might be a trade-off, right? I mean, I'm happy if Q is large enough to perhaps vote for the guy who offers me a policy that's not so close to my bliss point, right? So there's a trade-off. I'm willing potentially to vote for the guy I don't prefer on the policy dimension if I suppose his quality is large enough relative to the other candidate. Yeah.
So P is the policy of the candidate winning in equilibrium,
Exactly.
and Q is the quality of the candidate winning in equilibrium.
Yes, exactly. Well, of the candidate elected, right? Could of course be out of equilibrium, we have to consider too. So we should.
Everybody here is really only concerned about the equilibrium of this game. The voters and the candidates, everybody just cares about the equilibrium.
We shouldn't say care about the equilibrium, they care about the utility, right? And that will lead to an equilibrium.
Okay.
But they are rational, so they see the equilibrium.
Yes. So
Yes.
only the equilibrium values enter into the utility functions of every player. Okay.
In that, yes, as a solution of the model. Yeah, I said everything on this slide, I think. Okay, now comes really the point of the whole thing, right? If everybody was informed, that was simple, right? I just look at the quality of the candidate, I look at this policy position and the other candidate's policy position, I just vote for my favorite guy. So that would be very, very simple and a bit boring. And what we really want to talk about is what do people do who are not fully informed, right? So, informed voters observe the quality of the candidates before the elections, uninformed voters do not. Two types of voters for the moment. In the end, there will be even one more type. Informed voters are in the majority, but actually it's not necessary. I should have taken this out. I don't know why it's still there. In the newest version of the paper, it's clearly shown this is not necessary to make this assumption. What we really need is that there are some informed voters. And for this presentation, you find generalizations in the paper. I assume that the median voter is informed. So basically, the only assumption we have to make this whole thing hold is that there's one informed voter and he has the median position. Everybody else could be uninformed. My equilibrium would still work. So, and as I said, median voter is assumed to be informed here in the paper generalized. The intuition is much easier to get with this.
So the blessed guy has to be informed. The blessing comes from information.
The
so to speak,
pivotal, yeah.
bottom line.
No, I wouldn't say like this. Let's talk about the blessing later, because the blessing actually comes from the uninformed voters in the end.
How could it happen if some voters are informed, some are not? How?
Well, some voters study at a good school like this one, and some voters don't. And of course, studying at maybe also at some other place might increase your information. Reading newspapers increases your information. Of course, saying that some voters are not informed at all is a strong assumption, and some voters are fully informed. That's a strong assumption. It makes stuff simpler. I could alternatively assume that uninformed voters have some information. The assumption I really need is that I have some guys who are fully informed. Right? I could, uninformed voters would have exactly the same incentives if they could guess how good guys are, but would not exactly know. Can talk about details later. So what I really need is some people has to be fully informed, especially this guy at the media.
So
That's really the assumption I made.
they will know exactly what Q is. Others will have perception of Q.
Exactly. So for this talk, let's just say some people know Q, others people don't, to make it simple.
But other people know distribution of Q?
You don't really need to know the distribution. I think I wrote down here that I know it, but actually this is also an assumption I don't really need.
And distribution of P?
Distribution of P, it can be anything between 0 and 1, right? And then
But
it's announced, policy platforms are announced before the election, so there are only 2 P's that's possible, right? But people observe the policy platforms politicians announce before the elections. What should come on the next slide, I think.
But maybe he means that the distribution of the bliss points of the people, of their desired P, is that known to everybody?
So everybody will have to know who is the median voter. And what I forgot now I just assumed everybody knows what the median voter is, but that's actually the point where I wanted to show it with a piece of paper, but unfortunately there's no slide here. So let's just review for people who haven't heard it, what is actually the median voter. So we have many voters here, between 0 and 1, right? An odd number. And the median voter will just be the guy who has as many people with bliss points to the left of his bliss points as to the right of his bliss point. And then the standard result, if you just forget about the quality dimension here, if you just had a standard model of preference aggregation, it's a standard result that, that the, yes, but let me do it myself, thank you. That actually the median policy would be implemented. And why? Because both parties would have to converge there. Why is that? Well, if the median voter actually prefers a policy, then everybody to the left of him, either everybody to the left of him or everybody to the right of him will also prefer this policy, right? So if we just talk about policy, then the policy preferred by the median voter will always have a majority. Either because everybody to the left of him also supports it, or everybody to the right of him. And then if we add to this party competition or candidates competition, then the candidates will be forced to converge to this median position, because with any other position they would surely lose. Right? Because the other guy would offer the median position, or could offer it. And that turns out to be the only equilibrium. So, important, we have n voters, there's some guy who has as many people to the left of him as to the right of him, and he will usually decide the elections. And, well, actually he will also here decide the elections, but that's of course more complicated to show, because we have uninformed voters around. Okay. So, sequence of moves. Most of this we had already, but just to make it more clear. So, there's first nature, right? There's these candidate qualities drawn from some distribution that we actually don't even have to know. And we just say nature as game theorists. Nature chooses, well, the quality of the left candidate, the quality of the right candidate, and of course, if we know the quality of both candidates. We also know this variable v, that's just the difference between the quality of the right candidate and the quality of the left candidate. So that's the decide by random process. Then the candidates, they know their own quality and the quality of the competition. Right? So when they make their binding policy announcements, they know already how good they are and how good they are relative to their competitor on this quality dimension. Yeah. So then elections take place. And informed voters now, they know everything when they vote. They know the quality of the candidates, and thus also the V, and they of course see the policy positions announced by the candidates. The uninformed voters, they have less information. By assumption here, they see the policy positions announced, but they don't observe the quality. In the paper, I also relax this assumption that they actually observe the policy positions. You can make it more general, but to make it simple here, assume they all know the policy positions. Okay, and then we have an election, and to make it simple, although I have an example for American elections where the institutional setup is a bit more complicated, to make it simple, we assume the candidate with a majority of vote wins. Yeah? And then, because we have perfect commitment to policy positions, well, the policy platform the candidate announced before the elections will be implemented, will become the variable P. Right? Even if this candidate would actually prefer to implement his own bliss point.
Sorry.
Yeah?
If uninformed voters don't know anything about the quality, then how do they calculate their utility or expected utility if they don't know even the distribution of their
Yeah, this we will see on the next slide, because that's the point of the model, that they can actually, well, avoid making a mistake. Let's say it this way.
They imagine something.
So,
Yes.
just a question. I understand it is simplifying assumption, right? But is it so? You basically assume that people who know their quality are basically the quality of the two candidates is given by nature, right? While in reality, you would expect an endogenous mechanism with people knowing their quality, trying to find somebody with their same preference and better quality as much as possible, right?
Sure, I mean, you could imagine a stage before, right? Like primaries, where people run against each other and they might also be of different quality.
This would be compatible with this.
I think there's no contradiction here. Yeah, you might also have a rough, I mean, as I said, there could be any distribution. So in the primaries, you might reduce somewhat the distribution of these possible Qs, but in principle that is no contradiction to anything I'm saying on the following slides. Okay, how do we solve such a model? Well, we usually solve them backwards, and that's what I'm doing here. And so I begin with the voters, right? We have now already policy announcements by the parties, and now the voters have to decide. And we start with a simple problem of the informed voters. So the informed voters have all the information they need to make to know who's actually the candidate they prefer. And it will be a weakly dominating strategy for them to vote for the candidate they prefer. There are two possibilities. Well, there might be that their candidate wins anyway or loses anyway without their vote. But in case they are the pivotal voter, in case 50% vote left, 50% vote right, of course, you want to have voted for the guy whom you prefer, given his quality, given your preferences, given the policy announcement, because that maximizes your utility. And not very surprisingly, there is just a cutoff point. So there's one bliss point on this line, policy line 0,1, and everybody with a policy bliss point to the left of this point prefers the left candidate. Everybody who has a bliss point to the right of this point prefers the right candidate. And of course, if there is one voter who has exactly this policy bliss point, he would be totally indifferent, would not care if the left candidate wins or the right candidate wins, because this voter would be equally happy or unhappy with both candidates in office. Right? So, easy decision and easy to write it down. We just have to find this bliss point, and how do we do this? Well, we do it here. So, it's not very surprising how the formula looks like, I guess. So here, imagine there was no quality difference, right? Then the indifferent voter would, of course, be just in between these two policy platforms, right? He would have exactly the same distance between, to both candidates' policy platforms, and he would be indifferent. Everybody to the left of him would, of course, prefer the left guy. Assume this is the left guy, makes also the left policy announcement, he will in equilibrium. And everybody to the right of this point prefers the right guy. But then we have a trade-off, right? We have this quality difference here. And this here also matters essentially happens because we have quadratic disutility in policy. Well, so let's forget about this point. Let's just talk about this here. So the larger V, the further left this bliss point will be. Well, the larger V, the higher the quality advantage of the right candidate, right? So if this here is positive, the policy bliss point will be further left. Because some people, further left than just the point with equal distance to the platforms. Why? Because some people now would actually prefer the left candidate on the policy dimension, but V is large enough to more than compensate for that, and so they would still rather vote for the right candidate, given his high quality. This is negative. Of course, the whole thing here becomes positive, right? PR always larger than PL. And that means just some people now, although they're on the policy dimension, they would prefer the left candidate. They now vote for the right candidate because his quality is more than sufficient to make up for this. Yeah, as I said, voting according to this bliss point for informed voter, that's a weakly dominating strategy, right? It can never make them worse off. Doesn't matter what the candidates do. Doesn't matter what the uninformed voters do. Okay, so that was relatively easy. Now the interesting part. What can uninformed voters do? Well, I try to find a cutoff point. I will show you there is a cutoff point again. Every uninformed voter to the left of this cutoff point will support the left candidate, everybody to the right of this cutoff point, the right candidate, and this will be optimal for them. Of course, now, this cutoff point can only depend on policy positions, right? Why? Well, because that's the only information they have, right? It can't depend on quality. And as I said, the problem is, I don't know exactly who maximizes my utility. I might think, okay, the left candidate, because he's maybe closer to my bliss point, his policy platform, but I don't know for sure. And now, it's again important to keep this in mind. My vote matters only. 50% of the voters vote left, 50% vote right. Then my vote will decide over the elections. So if I somehow magically can make sure that in this one case, I cast the right vote, the vote for the guy I would support if I was fully informed, then this must be optimal for an uninformed voter. Okay. And now surprisingly, well, at least at first sight surprisingly, there's a very simple strategy that will lead to this. So, only thing I have to do is I have to vote for the left candidate if my preferences are to the left of the median voter. The median voter is just the voter who has, as I said before, as many guys who prefer a policy to the left of him as prefer a policy to the right of him. So, and now uninformed voters, I will show you in 1 second why that's an equilibrium, but that's just their strategy now. If they are to the left of the median, they vote for the candidate who announces a more left policy position. And if they are to the right of the median, they vote for the candidate who announces a more right-wing policy position.
Do they know where they are?
they know where they are relative to the median voter. That's the assumption I need. So that's, well, we can maybe later talk about why this is relatively innocent assumption in my view.
So it means that they don't have pay attention to Q. So it's basically they don't have their view on quality of the candidate.
They have no idea about quality. Well, they have no direct information about Q. They can indirectly make some inference if they really want from the fact of the policy positions, but they don't need to do this. The only thing they need to do is to follow this simple strategy. And so the assumption is they need to know where the median voter is. And let me just come with a justification already now. Well, there's lots of evidence that voters who are relatively centrist are relatively well informed. So most uninformed voters, at least, perhaps all, will be relative extreme, relative far left or relatively far right. And if they have such preferences, well, then it's also relatively easy to know that you are left of the median voter, right? If you are communist, in most countries you would just know you are to the left of the median voter. If you are, some kind of very right-wing person, yes, I try to avoid a word here, then you know your preferences are to the right of the median. And these are empirically seen also the people who are usually uninformed. So that's why this is maybe not quite such a strong assumption. Whereas people who are close to the center, who might be close to the media, they are more likely to be informed. Yes?
So I do not assume that the median voter of the whole population is also the median voter of the informed guys, right?
No, absolutely not.
Because if I would assume that, it would be obvious that this must be right. Because I would just I would just take the informed voters and would do what is right. They would deliver all information to me. But you don't assume that.
No, I don't assume. I should make this very clear, not only to you, but also to referees, who sometimes don't get this point, that when I talk about the median voter, I talk about the median voter of all, among all voters, right? Who has as many people to the left of them as to the right of them among all voters, informed voters as well as uninformed voters.
And you are just implying the median voter just looking at the bliss points distribution without any regard. So it's not conditioning on the quality, on the median voter after the information of the quality, but it's just purely about policy. Median voter about policy. So
yes, but I mean, yes, but because all voters care the same about quality, he will also be the median voter of all voters.
Yeah,
right?
because of the way the quality enters. In fact, I had another question. You have indeed that the quality enters in the utility function as an additive term.
Yes, and it's important, right? If quality was about bringing stuff through Congress, of course, as a left-wing guy, I might prefer a right-wing president who has no quality in this respect.
Yeah, also, the quality could increase, for example, I don't know, the variability of the outcomes, right? And that would change, instead of being a constant term, right? If the quality of the candidate would let the person to deliver more noisy results, you don't have this.
No, I mean, what's important, that's why I talk about fighting terrorism. It should be something related to what people agree on. Fighting terrorism, stopping the financial system from melting down, stuff like that.
So, and this is deterministic, so you have a point. So you have one value which is associated with the quality. Just, okay, that's okay.
Okay, so I did this, I suppose. So now, actually, if all uninformed voters do this, then actually it turns out that again the median voter turns out to be decisive. Why is this the case? Now assume, after observing, the median voter is informed, right? So after observing now the policy positions and the quality, assume the median voter votes left. Well, if the median voter votes left, then we know also all informed voters to the left of him will vote left, right? Because we had a cutoff point. We now know this median voter must be to the right or maybe exactly at the cutoff point. So everybody to the left of him who's informed is to the left of this cutoff point. So all informed voters to the left of him vote left. What about the uninformed voters? Well, if they follow the strategy I just proposed, they also vote left. Just because I, for the moment, made the assumption every uninformed voter to the left of the median policy point votes left, right? If that's a reasonable thing to do, we see it later. But assume they do it, then if the median voter votes left, the left candidate has a majority. What is if the median voter votes right? Well, then we know he's maximizing his utility, the cutoff point for informed voters must be to the left of him. That means all informed voters to the right of him must be to the right of the cutoff point, must also vote for the right candidate. What about the uninformed voters? Well, if they are to the right of the median, they also vote right. So in this case, the median and all voters, informed as well as uninformed, to the right of the median vote right. The right candidate wins. The median voter turns out to be decisive. Yeah, if normally I would make a little drawing here now to make this even clearer, but it should actually be clear. Given the strategies I proposed, the median voter decides.
Yeah, I just have some simple or maybe stupid question. If it's all matters for the median guy, if we can get rid of all people, because we know, you said we know who's the median. If we know, it makes no sense for me to vote. So I send this median to vote for me, and that's it. And he will choose. I'm for sure he will be happy if he's informed.
In a certain sense, that's exactly what the uninformed voters do in my model. In a certain sense, you as an uninformed voter, think about who is the voter you would want to delegate your decision to.
Exactly.
We will see this in 1 second. It really can be interpreted this way.
So maybe the big assumption is knowing who's the median guy, and that's a big assumption.
What?
If we know.
No, you don't know who's the median. You know if you're to the left or to the right of the median. That's a weaker assumption.
But how? You have to know the median to know if you are to the left.
No, as I say, if you are very, very left-wing,
Again,
you will know you're to the left
That's
of the.
easy, yeah. If you're an extreme.
It's more problematic. It's more problematic for centrist voters,
Exactly.
but they are most of the time informed. So that's my. I mean, there's empirical evidence
There are
for that.
lots of small assumptions there.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah,
That's
I admit there are small assumptions. Okay. Now the question is: this is optimal for uninformed voters? And let me come back also to all these assumptions. Remind me if I don't do it when I do the conclusion. Okay, why is this optimal, or can it be optimal?
Sorry.
Yeah, please.
You said median voter is the one who, like 50% of voters votes to the left and to the right of him, right?
Well, now, big by assumption, but the definition is 50% have policy preference to the left of him, 50% have preference to the right of them. And now it turns out, if they follow this strategy, or the voters, then it will also be the case that if he actually votes left, all the people to the left of him vote left. Of course, there could be some people to the right of him also voting left. I didn't rule this out, actually. And it's just the centrist voter in the sense of having as many people to the left, as many people to the right, on the policy dimension between 0 and 1. Okay, so proposed strategies. Question: do we have an equilibrium? Right. So we know already the informed voters do something optimal. Next question is it also optimal for the uninformed voters? So the only thing we have to show is that given what all the other guys, how all the other guys vote, I don't want to deviate. Right? So basically we ask now the question, if I'm to the left of the median as an uninformed voter, would I want to follow this strategy? Given that I know how the informed voters vote, know their cutoff point, and of course also taking as given that all the other uninformed voters actually follow this strategy. Right? Because to establish an equilibrium, we just have to show that nobody has a reason to deviate. Right? So everybody else follows this strategy now to vote either as an informed voter for the guy he or she prefers, and as an uninformed voter to be either to the left or to the right of the media. And now I show that actually an uninformed voter somewhere to the left here doesn't have a reason to deviate from this. And the same logic will apply to voters to the right. I won't show it, but if you understand the logic for the guy who's to the left, you will understand the logic for the guys to the right. And so here we go through 3 situations basically. Let's first also explain this here. Okay, so this is the cutoff point. So this is just the position of the median voter, right? And this here, this is the voter who would actually decide the elections, the informed voter who would decide the elections if an uninformed voter somewhere here would deviate. Then the right candidate would need one less vote. Sorry, the left candidate. No, the right candidate. If one guy here to the left would vote right instead of left, then the right candidate would need one less vote by informed voters to win the elections. And that means the informed voter, one position further to the right on the line of all informed voters would decide the elections instead of the median voter. Right? And so, by casting my vote for the left candidate, this uninformed voter basically makes the median voter the decisive voter who decides the elections. And by casting for the right candidate, he would actually make this guy decide the elections, who has these preferences. So it's basically what he's doing is exactly what you said. He delegates in a sense. Given the strategy of all other players, he delegates either to this guy or to this guy. He might not even know exactly where this guy is. He must just be somewhere to the right of the median voter. And now there are three different situations possible. So imagine the cutoff point for the informed voters is here, given by this equation, as before. Then we know, well, it's to the left of the median, right? So the median votes right. And of course, an informed voter to the right of the median votes also right. So that means the right guy, the right candidate is going to win the elections, right? It doesn't matter how this voter votes. He delegates to this guy or to this guy the decision, indirectly, but they both vote right. So the two voters who can be decisive, given the strategies of all the other voters, make the same decision. It doesn't make a difference. Next situation. Here, the cutoff point for the informed voters is very far to the right. And that means this guy votes left, this guy votes left. Again, a voter here basically decides, if I vote left, this guy decides the elections. If I vote right, this guy decides the elections. Again, it doesn't make a difference. Why? Because both these guys vote left. So the left candidate wins. Doesn't matter what I do. So under what condition do I make a difference? Only the cutoff point is somewhere between the median voter and this alternative decisive voter. Then my vote makes a difference. The only possibility. The cutoff point is somewhere here in this area. But if the cutoff point is somewhere there, well, then I must prefer the left candidate to win. Why? Well, the median prefers the left candidate to win. I'm to the left of the median myself. So the only situation I can be in where I decide the elections, I actually make the right decision. All right? So whenever I'm pivotal, I make the right decisions. And that's all I care about, because that is all that enters my utility function. Of course, exactly the same logic would apply to an uninformed voter somewhere to the right of the median. Exactly the same logic would apply. He would decide basically between the median voter deciding the elections and some guy to the left of the median voter deciding the elections, and the same logic applies. And so we actually, well, we don't have an equilibrium yet, right? Because, of course, for an equilibrium, we need also the candidates. But we know, if voters vote like this, well, they wouldn't want to deviate. Whatever the candidates play. Even if the candidates play out of equilibrium, this is what voters want to do, right? So it's very robust in this sense. Doesn't even matter that the candidates play equilibrium. Of course, he will solve it for that. If all voters play like this, none of the voters would want to deviate. None of the uninformed voters. Yeah, please.
So it doesn't mean that I only vote in the case if I think that I'm pivotal, if I'm uninformed voter, for example.
No, it's
otherwise it doesn't make sense.
No, it's very important that you always vote. Otherwise, you couldn't make this assumption. I mean, I don't know if I'm pivotal, right? That's the point.
So
But
I consider that I'm pivotal, right? If I'm an uninformed voter, I consider that I'm pivotal in this case.
Yes. You want to make the right decision conditional on being pivotal without knowing if you will be pivotal. Right? So that you vote right in the sense of correct, maximizing your utility, in the only situation in which it matters. But it's very important you always go to the elections, because otherwise this wouldn't be in equilibrium anymore. Actually, think about, it also rules out abstentions here. Why wouldn't I want to abstain? I wouldn't want to abstain. Assume, reasonable assumption, when we abstain and both candidates get the same amount of votes, they will throw a coin. Right? So here it doesn't matter if I abstain, right? Because, well, the right guy wins anyway. Here it doesn't matter if I abstain, the left guy wins anyway. Here if I abstain, it matters. Now if I abstain actually, normally the guy supported by this median voter, whom I also prefer, would win with one vote. Now if I abstain, they will throw a coin, and there will be 50% chance I get the candidate elected I want, and a 50% chance the guy I prefer is not elected. And that means abstaining would also be a mistake, right? So that's why uninformed voters don't want to abstain. They want, basically, by voting, they make sure their preferences will be considered, right, in this election. If they abstained, they couldn't have this. By voting, you still provide incentives to the politicians, as you will also see, very soon. As I said, same logic for uninformed voters to the right of the median. No reason to deviate and vote left instead of right. And as I say, also would be a bad idea to abstain. Okay. Okay, now back to the candidates. Who is the candidate who's voted into office? We now know it will be the candidate who has the support of the median voter. So standard logic applies now. I have to make the median voter reasonably happy, let's say it this way, to be elected. And it follows also directly, well, we will have the same result, if this equilibrium is played, as if all voters were fully informed. Right? Because the median voter decides, same situation as if everybody was fully informed. So what would happen if everybody was fully informed? Well, assume, for the moment, the right candidate has a quality advantage. So for sure he can win by just taking the median position, right? What can the other candidate do? Also take the median position to convince the median voter, but it's not enough, right? Because this guy has a quality advantage by assumption now. But of course, maybe he can do better than play the median position. He can go closer
to his position.
Preferred policy position BR. So the furthest he can go and still win the election, the other guy does the reasonable thing and choose the median position, is this Bm plus V to the power of 0.5. It comes from the utility function. You can easily check that, right? The larger this advantage, the more he can deviate to the right. But of course, he wouldn't want to go too far to the right because, well, he wouldn't want to go further than his own bliss point, right? As a moderate Republican, you wouldn't want to implement radical Republican policies even if you could get a majority for it. Yeah, please?
I'm a bit confused. So you just said that the median voter will always win, like in the standard model? Decide, yes. So now, if I'm a candidate who has a quality advantage,
yes.
So if the median voter always win, how can I deviate from the median voter? Because then the other, I'm not concerned about winning. Now I understand. I'm only concerned about the outcome. So I might be losing if I deviate from the median position.
No.
You still win. I mean, this may be the position where the median voter is just indifferent. Or I just assume if the median voter is indifferent, he votes for the higher quality guy. Alternatively, you could just take a position very, very slightly to the left of this position to make the median voter prefer you. Because there's this trade-off in policy and quality. And of course, here the median voter will prefer this guy on the policy dimension. But because I have this quality advantage, I can move to the right and still make the median voter indifferent, at least. And, well, the larger my quality advantage, the further I can move to the right, and this to the power of 0.5, that comes basically because you have this quadratic disutility in distance, right? Okay, so, exactly. And of course, I don't go too far. This is how far I can go and still win, but I wouldn't want to go further than my preferred policy position. And here exactly the same. And the other guy takes the median position. Why does he take the median position? Because that makes it as difficult as possible for the better right, for the higher quality right candidate to win, right? You still have an incentive to compete, so to speak, right? Not to make it impossible for the other guy to win with a too extreme position, right? To go too close to his bliss point. Exactly the opposite if the left candidate has a quality advantage. Then the best the right candidate can do is take the median position to make it as difficult as possible for the left candidate to convince the median voter. And then this term here gives us the furthest. Now, of course, you have negative, right? We go to the left from the median. Now, minus v means something negative, right? So this becomes something positive. This is how far to the left he can go and still make the median voter indifferent, given the v, the left candidate. But of course, he would never want to go further to the left than his own preferred policy point. Right?
So always the good guy is elected.
Yes.
Very optimistic.
Why? No. I mean, I haven't made a welfare statement here, right? It's a higher quality guy, but it could still lead to extreme policies, right? And that can make extreme voters very unhappy. Because this is what the median voter wants. A very far left person would potentially suffer very much from a very far right person in office. So it's not necessarily super good from a welfare perspective, so far at least. Yeah, implemented policies, of course. Always the policy position, the higher quality candidate proposes an equilibrium. So always the higher quality candidate wins. Good. That was for totally rational voters, right? But now comes the title of the paper, and well, there was once this movie that I still haven't watched, where somehow Kevin Costner, so somehow his vote is getting lost. I can't remember the story, as I said, I should really watch the movie. But somehow two presidential candidates get exactly the same number of voters in some state that also decides the elections. And his vote is lost, and then somehow these two candidates have to compete for him personally. Right? That's the point of the movie. So it's a slightly different story, but yeah, he swings the vote, right? So to speak.
You don't need to watch the movie, you know the story, that's the whole thing.
Yeah, so it's a bit similar, of course. So, right, we now assume these uninformed voters, they made this, we're not so complicated the calculations, but they did all these calculations and realized I vote left if I'm left to the median, right if I'm right to the median. Now I assume, okay, there is some group of voters that doesn't get this. They vote for the guy that's closer to them. One reason could also be they just don't know where the median is, right? Let's take this assumption away that some people anyway didn't like, that people actually know where they are relative to the median. Well, then it might be a reasonable thing to do, right? Just vote like this. Just vote for the guy who is closer to you. Everybody to the left of this point who is uninformed, we vote for the left candidate. Every guy to the right of this point for the right candidate. So either because they don't understand what it means to be pivotal, because they didn't do the analysis, or also because maybe they don't know where the median is, and you can't play the strategy if you don't know that. And actually one more motivation. There is some older political science literature where it just assumed that uninformed voters do this. So even the political scientists didn't get this idea what it means to be pivotal. That was before Feders and Pesendorfer wrote their paper. Okay, I go through this in the paper. In the paper I also show it when there are three types of voters. Uninformed voters who are rational, uninformed voters who are naive, and they have to do something complicated then, because they know they're naive voters, and then the median point won't be the cutoff point anymore. All very complicated. I stick here to the case where there are only naively voting uninformed voters, and only one to make it simple. But qualitatively, the results can be generalized to all imaginable cases, with fully rational as well as boundedly rational uninformed voters. So what happens? Okay, so now it's not Kevin voting. Here's John von Neumann, right? Inventor of game theory. And, well, actually, Jürgen Weibull told me he should be somewhere here, somewhere there to the far right, if his preferences were depicted correctly, but I assumed for the moment he is left of the median. Right? And I chose McCain against Obama because they were both new candidates when they were running against each other. Right? So there was little information, relatively. None of them was president when they were running against each other. So it's reasonable that voters don't know their quality. And then I also assume here, to make it also consistent with the result of the elections, that V is negative. So Obama is the guy who's going to win. McCain does the best he can do, according to what I gave you before, takes the median position. Obama goes as far as he can do without making the median voter, whose name we don't know, not liking him anymore, right? So is as far as he can go, still winning the median vote. And John von Neumann, he's so focused on game theory. He's not informed, right? But he just took a pen and piece of paper and did these calculations I did, and he realized this McCain guy is really closer to my preferences, but no, I vote for Obama because I should vote to the left if I'm left of the median voter. And I know I'm left of the median voter. Okay, so that's John von Neumann. But assume, now instead of this highly sophisticated John von Neumann, we have Kevin, a Hollywood star, right? And he's also very busy making movies, so he can't read the newspapers. And, yeah, he's left of center. For a Hollywood star, he's not very left-wing, right? Quite moderate for a Hollywood star. But, yeah, otherwise he's the same as John von Neumann. The difference now is, of course, Kevin is naive. So if they took the same positions, he would vote for McCain. And now comes really the point that policy positions are endogenous here. Because Obama would foresee this. He doesn't want to lose with one vote because of Kevin, and he has to move to the center. To win either Kevin's vote or the vote of some other guy who's informed and would vote for him now. And this is really why this paper is called the swing voters' blessing. We have now these naive, uninformed swing voters, but they lead to policies that are more moderate, right? He has to move closer to the center, to the median voter, and by moving closer to the median voter, he moves closer to more than half of the voters out there, right? Because, well, half of the voters are here and to the right of this. And that means the majority of voters must be better off, right? So in this sense, democracy works better. The majority of voters is better off.
So this guy moves right, even though he has to stick to what he announces as a policy.
Now, of course, he announces a different policy, right?
And he has to stick to it.
Yeah, he has to stick to it. These policy announcements are, of course, made before the vote takes place. Right, so, yeah.
That means, like, because of these naive voter, the higher quality candidate has to have a more democratic position, so to say.
Well, a more centrist position, yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. And that's why the paper is called the swing voters' blessing, right? Contrary to Feddersen, Pesendorfer, they had a model where basically Obama couldn't adjust, right? I mean, there was no real Obama and no McCain, but there was a bridge being built or not being built. There was no adjustment being made to the voters. Here, policy positions are endogenous, and if I make them endogenous, the high quality guy will still win, and we don't get a curse of the swing voter, of this slightly naive Hollywood star here, but he's actually a bless. He's like someone who can commit to vote for the guy whose preferences are closer to his. Right? It's like saying, like calling Obama before the elections. Listen, Obama, I really like you personally. I think you're high quality, but if you go too far to the left, I don't vote for you. It's like, you can't commit to this. Right? It would not be credible. Obama would think, no, he will vote for me anyway, because he prefers me. But if I'm naive and don't understand this, that I actually should vote left if I'm to the left of the median, that gives me kind of commitment power to punish politicians for taking too extreme positions.
Can I try to summarize what I understand? So the higher the quality difference, the more the person can be extreme policies.
Yes.
And then the bigger is the group or the population of naive voters. Is this the number or their location or what?
It's both. Its location is very important. If Kevin was somewhere here, it wouldn't make a difference in this case.
Yeah, no, yeah. But basically the group, the number of population that could be classified as naive voters.
Yes.
If they are many people, then you can assume like a maybe homogeneous distribution of some sort wherever they are. Well, you would move closer to the center.
Yeah, so what I show is what I show in the paper is basically having naive voters can never lead to more extreme policies. Sometimes policies will stay the same if you turn one sophisticated voter into a naive voter, but if it makes a difference, it will always move the equilibrium closer to the center. Right? It depends, of course, on the cues, the details. But the only effect it can have on policy that will be implemented in equilibrium is to move policy closer to the majority of voters, closer to the median voter. And if you think democracy is about the majority of voters, this, of course, is a good thing. Okay, let me summarize if I still have time for that. Yeah, so in a sense, if voters are too well informed, it can decrease electoral competition. Right? The problem here is also we have two dimensions. Voters can only vote on one dimension, so to speak. So, I mean, this quality thing basically reduces political competition, right? Because the better candidate, the higher quality candidate can get away with non-median positions. And then if we take away some of the information, and in addition assume some of these uninformed voters are boundedly rational, we get actually better results, not worse results. And now you can, of course, say, okay, interesting result, but well, he made lots of small assumptions, something like this, right? What I can say is, well, in the second part, it works also if people don't know where the median voter is, right? They could follow this strategy, everything would be fine. And also, of course, there is this famous result of the curse of the swing voter. And even if you don't believe all my assumptions and all details of my model, you should for sure believe that this other paper by Feders and Pesendorfer that makes also lots of little assumptions, that you shouldn't necessarily believe their result, right? Because you change a little bit, you get totally different results. So be at least, at the minimum, very careful with their result. Even if you find some of my assumptions not perfectly credible, the minimum message is it depends on details, and you shouldn't take the swing voter curse result. Shouldn't be too sure about it. If you endogenize policy, essentially you get the opposite, right? And well, if it's all right, then of course the majority of voters are better off. In this case, right? If we have naive and uninformed voters instead of fully rational voters or only informed voters, right? The naive are the electorate.
How about misinformed voters?
Misinformed. Could you be more precise?
Well, Q, I mean, is given and is known by informed voters, not known by uninformed, but it's possible to manipulate the Q, right? So the whatever Q you report, basically, will determine the outcome of the voting process in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, Q is, but
who measures it is complicated. How they measure it is complicated.
it's also true that many different people have different
Perception.
perceptions of the quality of the candidates, right? So there is a distribution of cues in minds of people, for example. That's kind of what I'm trying to say.
Right. I mean, there are potentially some issues, and that's why I also put this down a bit.
Kind of
put in context. This model is as credible as the other model, and we get the opposite results. So very careful with these. There are some problems if quality has influence on how I bring stuff to Congress and stuff. There are some strong assumptions. I mean, I still think this basic message that naive voters can vote. I mean, just voters who just vote by policy. This should be a result that always holds in much more models. Voters who will look only at the policy and not at other things, they will force people to take more centrist position. And this is a result that should be very robust to many of the assumptions I made and should hold in a much more general setup, right? And I think that's an important thing to show.
Okay, then thank you.
Thank you.